Alright, it's time to look at the history of the comic strip. I've been looking forward to this day because I could show you what Buster Brown looked like. So we're looking at the Encyclopedia of Comic Strips and the Smithsonian Collection of Newspaper Comics. So just looking at the next day, we can see an early version of the Katzenjammer Kids. Now, I'm not entirely sure about this strip. Was this actually a daily strip, or was this a Sunday strip which hasn't been colored? I am not entirely sure. We're still in the introduction of this book. I will point out a couple of things. One, we have this narration here, which essentially tells us the plot. The Katzenjammer kids change Grandpa's glasses. Everything seems bigger through these spectacles until Grandpa discovers the joke. So we have narration that actually tells us what it's going to show us. As typical of that time period, we also have numbers for the panels, because panels were essentially a newfangled technology of a sort, or at least a visual language. Now, because this was invented for an English-speaking audience, action begins left to right. So we see the kids, and then we see Grandpa, and this is a convention which we barely think about in Western comics, but keep in mind that this actually had to be invented and experimented with, and we will see that with these early comics. The idea of things on the left happen before things on the right, sometimes even in the exact same panel. Another thing is something that's interesting about art, and I don't know whether this is universal about art or just Western art, is we like to divide things either into thirds or in fourths. So comic panels often naturally divide into fours or into threes. That can apply to a whole page, or that can apply to a single column. I guess that may be analogous to music. I'm not a musical person myself, but I do know that thirds and fourths have some place there. But anyway, we see this even in 1898, sort of that natural division. So the children, sort of like Bart Simpson, they steal Grandpa's spectacles in this case, and so here these animals are drawn larger. This is to show things from his perspective. So what's interesting about comics, even from the very beginning, is that we see things that are not literal. So there's Grandma there, the distortion in the mirror, and the children have been distorted. This playing with reality is an integral part of the comic strip visual language. Okay, and then here, this was drawn by Rudolf Dirks, and then this panel is just to show us that his brother was also a comic illustrator. When I see snail with a package, I think of the modern term snail mail, but back then that was just talking about the newspapers. Anyway, let's look at Buster Brown. So this is the same cartoonist who gave us the Yellow Kid, and this is very remarkable. So this is about 1904. We have different dates. I don't know if we have when things were reprinted or whatever. Let's just say around the turn of the century. But you have to keep in mind, this is the time before radio, obviously before film and television and things like that. So opening up a newspaper and seeing these bright colors, this was a completely new experience. Now, I know some books had a few color plates in them, but this was a full newspaper page. This would have been huge, much larger than this book. So this was a unique experience, but it was also affordable for all classes of people. And newspapers, of course, were passed around. They were used in everyday activities. They were read aloud. Newspapers were a lot more interactive than newspapers are today. In many ways, these turn-of-the-century newspapers were the Facebook and YouTube of that time. Now, in terms of the story, let's talk about Buster Brown for a moment. What's interesting about Buster Brown is that we have really the beginning of a comic archetype, which in many ways is with us today. Now, I haven't seen anyone discuss this, so maybe these are just my rambling thoughts, but with Buster Brown, we have the boy character who has an animal friend who may or may not be magical, and the magical animal talks. This boy goes on adventures. Are these adventures real? Are they not real? We are not entirely sure. These adventures may be sort of a dream-like state. The boy also has a girlfriend back home who I I'm not sure. Does Mary Jane have red hair? She may. I'm not really sure. I haven't seen her in these two pictures. But anyway, what I'm saying is that Buster Brown and Little Nemo, who we will meet soon, or we've met before in some of my earlier videos, this is an archetype that gets repeated again and again in the comic strips. Buster Brown, Little Nemo, Barnaby, Calvin and Hobbes, Charlie Brown, and Snoopy. The boy, magical animal companion, dream world. And of course, Buster Brown does remind me of the name Charlie Brown. Tig is not quite as kind of unique as Snoopy, but or Hobbs, I mean, but there are some similarities. I would also point out Buster Brown does remind me a bit of Pogo, and Tig is a little bit like Albert, the alligator. But so yeah, this is just something that gets repeated again and again, and this was more than 100 years ago. This is the earliest version of Calvin and Hobbes, or Phoebe and her unicorn, or in some ways cul-de-sac. Now, obviously, there are many other types of comic strip genres out there. I would say the comic book archetypes also sort of grows from this. I mean, Buster Brown, his imagination sort of becomes the Superman imagination, in which we move from sort of a child fantasy to more of an adolescent fantasy in a different type of dream world. So anyway, with Buster Brown, what's interesting is, well, one, this layout reminds me a little bit of a Where's Waldo page or Where's Wally page for some parts of the world. But how is the story told? Well, the story is told with letters, maybe those are postcards. We have balloons, we have panels here, and then we sort of have this great poster display. Now, the plot is that Buster Brown is going to merry old England and having adventures there. And so he has a friend there, and he's writing home to his little girlfriend, Mary Jane, who I'm going to imagine is the little red-headed girl. And what he's saying is that what's interesting about Great Britain is that they have advertisements all over the place. Sort of what we would call pop-up ads. They had as billboards on every single horse-drawn carriage here. And so as we follow Buster Brown, we're supposed to look at all of these crazy advertisements. We have placards, and we have just kind of all of these crazy things. And we're supposed to notice all of these little details, and these details tell us a story. Now, in modern comics, we would probably have several panels to tell the story. What we're supposed to do is we're supposed to look at one little picture and figure out the whole story. Think of it as a New Yorker magazine, cartoon, but imagine a whole bunch of them crammed together. So this guy, he gets crushed by a wheel, and he says, ouch. Some H's fall down from an advertisement. Dogs are looking cute. We have this guy crashing into a thing. We have horses crashing into each other. And we have crazy advertisements that don't make any sense. So these are all lots of jokes. There's even a political joke here about Roosevelt. The first Roosevelt. So this, imagine this as a huge page, bright color, people are sharing it, and they're sort of supplying their own stories and interacting with this. So this is the beginning of kind of the comic strip story. Now here we have another Buster Brown. Now this one is, I would suppose, more of a Where's Wally picture in a way. So a traveling photographer, because photography was a brand new, well, it wasn't brand new, photography had been around for decades, But still, I mean, you have traveling photographers visiting people, taking pictures, and Buster Brown is talking about visiting a farm and sort of he's wondering whether animals have feelings too. And so we have the man taking a photograph of everyone, and we get to have some of the dialogue of the animals. And the joke is basically, it's the same joke we have with Chanticleer or Aesop's fables, is that we give animals human language and some human sensibilities in a way. And so it's like he's lining up for a class picture in a way, and we're supposed to look at all of these little details and just sort of enjoy it uh, as kind of a whimsical thing. Um, Now, from in this size, it is hard to read some of this dialogue, and some of it isn't really jokes. It's more some of it is more how to say it, kind of sentimental, as in, oh, I wish we could think of animals as pets, and maybe they're like people, and um, almost a Sesame Street vibe in a way. Anyway, this is beautiful artwork, and it is wonderful to see the beginning of comics here, and to see what has stayed and how it's developed in different ways. I really think that Buster Brown and his dog Tag, these are some really good designs, and I think they could bring this back as a modern comic strip. I would still keep it around, and I would keep it in the 1910s. But Buster Brown could have adventures with the Yellow Kid, Olcott's other invention. I don't know if anyone still owns Little Nemo. I would think Little Nemo's public domain by now. But I mean, I think you could tell all types of whimsical and lovely comic strips that take place in this time period. And artists could really be creative with this format. They could do dailies, and then they could do Sundays, and I don't know. There's so much rich artistry here. Anyway, that will be it for today. And tomorrow we can take a look at a more of a story for Buster Brown in panels, and we can look in depth at a Katzenjammer Kid cartoon. All right, goodbye.